It was a day she would never forget, no matter how much time passed. She had been living in the monastery for years, dedicating her life to prayer, service, and a quiet existence far from the chaos of the outside world. The routine was sacred: early mornings, silent prayers, and days filled with work and devotion. But that morning, everything changed. It started with Sister Lucy collapsing during the morning service. At first, everyone thought it was just exhaustion or illness, but when the doctor arrived and delivered the unthinkable news that Sister Lucy was pregnant, the entire monastery was thrown into chaos. She remembered the shock, the whispers, the way the other nuns looked at each other with fear and confusion. How could this happen? They had all taken vows of chastity, and no man had ever set foot inside the monastery walls. The air felt heavy, like the walls themselves were closing in. She could see the panic in Mother Superior Mary's eyes, the way her hands trembled as she tried to maintain order. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. This wasn't just a mistake or a sin. It felt like something darker, something no one was ready to face. And as the day unfolded, it became clear that this was only the beginning of a nightmare none of them could have imagined. As the news spread, the atmosphere in the monastery shifted from one of quiet devotion to one of fear and suspicion. The nuns, who had once been like sisters, now looked at each other with uncertainty. No one wanted to believe that one of them could have broken their vows, but the evidence was there, and it was impossible to ignore. Mother Superior Mary tried to keep everyone calm, but even she seemed shaken. She ordered the doctor to examine all the nuns, hoping to find some explanation, some mistake. But as the examinations continued, the situation only grew worse. One by one, more nuns were found to be showing the same signs as Sister Lucy. By the end of the day, 12 nuns were suspected of being pregnant. The weight of the accusations was unbearable. She could see the confusion and fear in the eyes of the others, the way they clutched their rosaries and whispered prayers under their breath. No one knew what to do or who to trust. The monastery, once a place of peace and safety, now felt like a prison. And as the sun set that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger was at play. This wasn't just about the nuns. It felt like the entire foundation of their faith was being tested. But even in the midst of the chaos, she held on to one thought. There had to be an explanation, and she was determined to find it no matter what it took. The whispers among the nuns grew louder, and the tension became almost suffocating. Some of the younger nuns, like Sister Helen, were visibly trembling, their faces pale with fear. Sister Agnes, one of the older nuns, tried to comfort them, but even her voice wavered. The idea that they could all be expelled, cast out from the only home they had ever known, was too much to bear. She remembered the way Mother Superior Mary had looked at her earlier that day, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and determination. It was clear that Mother Mary didn't believe the accusations either, but without proof, there was little she could do. The bishop had already been informed, and his arrival was imminent. She knew that once he stepped foot in the monastery, things would only get worse. The bishop was known for his strictness, his unwavering adherence to the rules, and his intolerance for any hint of scandal. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the accusations pressing down on her chest. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, she clung to the belief that the truth would come out. She didn't know how or when, but she refused to give up hope. The thought of being cast out, of losing everything she had worked for, was unbearable. But even more unbearable was the thought of living with the shame of an accusation she knew wasn't true. She had to fight, not just for herself, but for all of them. And as the night deepened, she made a silent promise to herself. She would find the truth, no matter what it took. The next morning, the bishop arrived, and with him came an air of finality that made the monastery feel even more like a prison. She watched from a distance as he stepped out of his carriage, his expression stern and unyielding. The nuns were gathered in the courtyard, their heads bowed, their hands clasped tightly in prayer. She could feel the tension in the air, like a storm about to break. The bishop wasted no time. He called for an immediate meeting, and the nuns were herded into the chapel like sheep to the slaughter. She sat in the back, her heart pounding, her mind racing. The bishop's voice was cold and sharp as he addressed them, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. He spoke of sin, of betrayal, of the disgrace they had brought upon the church. She wanted to scream, to tell him that they were innocent, but she knew it would do no good. The bishop had already made up his mind. He ordered that the 12 accused nuns be isolated, forbidden from speaking to anyone. The rest of the nuns were to remain in the monastery, under strict supervision. She could see the fear in the eyes of the others, the way they clung to each other for comfort. But she also saw something else, a flicker of defiance. They might be afraid, but they weren't broken. Not yet. As the bishop's men began to separate the accused nuns from the rest, she felt a surge of anger. This wasn't justice. This was a witch hunt, and she wasn't going to stand by and let it happen. She didn't know how, but she was going to fight back. She had to, for herself, for the others, and for the truth. The bishop's men moved with efficiency, their faces blank, as if they were simply following orders without question. She watched as Sister Lucy, the first to be accused, was led away, her face pale and her eyes filled with tears. Sister Agnes, one of the older nuns, tried to protest, but she was quickly silenced. The bishop's voice echoed through the chapel, cold and unrelenting. "This is not a time for questions," he said. "This is a time for judgment." She felt a chill run down her spine. The bishop's words were final and there was no room for doubt in his tone. But she couldn't accept that. She couldn't accept that their lives, their faith, could be destroyed so easily. She looked around the chapel at the faces of the other nuns and saw the same determination in their eyes. They might be afraid, but they weren't defeated. Not yet. As the bishop's men continued to separate the accused nuns, she made a silent vow. She would find a way to prove their innocence, no matter what it took. She didn't know how, but she knew she couldn't give up. The truth was out there, and she was going to find it. Later that day, as the monastery fell into an uneasy silence, she found herself alone in the chapel, kneeling before the altar. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her, but she refused to let it crush her. She prayed not just for herself but for all the nuns who had been accused. She prayed for strength, for clarity, and for the courage to do what needed to be done. As she sat there, she began to piece together the events of the past few weeks, trying to find some clue, some explanation for what had happened. She thought about the food they had eaten, the water they had drunk, the routines they had followed, and then it hit her. Something had changed. A few weeks ago, the monastery had started receiving supplies from a new source. At the time, it had seemed like a blessing, a way to ease their burdens, but now she wondered if it had been something else entirely. She remembered the strange taste of the water, the way some of the nuns had complained of feeling unwell. At the time, they had dismissed it as nothing, but now it all seemed connected. She didn't have proof, but she had a suspicion, and that was enough to give her hope. She knew she couldn't do this alone, though. She needed help. And there was only one person she could think of who might be willing to listen: Father John, a priest from a nearby village who had always been kind to the nuns. She didn't know if he would believe her, but she had to try. As she stood up from the altar, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let the bishop's accusations destroy everything they had worked for. She was going to fight back, and she was going to win. The chapel was quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of her habit as she moved. She glanced around, making sure no one was watching, and then slipped out the side door. The night was cool, the moon casting a pale light over the monastery grounds. She moved quickly, staying in the shadows, her heart pounding with every step. She knew the risks. If she was caught, there would be no explaining her way out of it. But she also knew she had no choice. She had to get to Father John. She had to tell him what she suspected. As she made her way through the darkened courtyard, she thought about the other nuns, locked away in their rooms, their futures hanging in the balance. She thought about Sister Lucy, so young and terrified, and Sister Agnes, who had always been a source of strength for the others. She couldn't let them down. She had to keep going, no matter how scared she was. The gate was just ahead, but she knew it would be guarded. She paused, her breath catching in her throat, and then she saw him, Father Vincent, one of the priests who had accompanied the bishop. He was standing near the gate, his back to her. For a moment she thought about turning back, but then she remembered the faces of the other nuns, the fear in their eyes. She couldn't give up now. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. Father Vincent turned as she approached, his expression unreadable in the dim light. For a moment she thought he would stop her, demand to know what she was doing out so late. But instead, he simply nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. She didn't know why he was letting her go, but she didn't have time to question it. She slipped past him and through the gate, her heart racing as she stepped out into the night. The village wasn't far, but every step felt like a mile. The darkness pressed in around her, and every sound made her jump. She kept her eyes on the path ahead, her mind focused on one thing: finding Father John. She didn't know if he would believe her, but she had to try. As she walked, she thought about everything that had happened, the way the bishop had dismissed their pleas, the way the other nuns had looked at her with fear and desperation. She couldn't let them down. She had to keep going, no matter how scared she was. The village was quiet when she arrived, the streets empty and the windows dark. She made her way to Father John's house, her heart pounding as she knocked on the door. For a moment, there was no answer, and she thought he might not be home. But then the door opened, and there he was, his face filled with concern as he saw her standing there. She didn't waste any time. She told him everything: the accusations, the bishop's harsh judgment, her suspicions about the supplies. She could see the shock in his eyes, but he didn't interrupt. He listened, his expression growing more serious with every word. When she finished, he was silent for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Then he nodded, his voice firm. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he said. "I promise." She felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. They both knew the road ahead would be difficult, and there was no guarantee they would succeed. But for the first time in weeks, she felt like she wasn't alone. She had an ally, and together, they would fight for the truth. Father John invited her inside, and they sat down to discuss their next steps. He asked her detailed questions about the supplies, the symptoms the nuns had experienced, and the timeline of events. She answered as best she could, her mind racing as she tried to recall every detail. Father John listened intently, his face growing more serious with each passing moment. He explained that if her suspicions were correct, and the nuns had been poisoned, they would need concrete evidence to prove it. He suggested they consult a trusted doctor, someone who could examine the nuns and determine the cause of their symptoms. She agreed, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. The bishop had already made up his mind, and he wouldn't take kindly to anyone challenging his authority. But they had no other choice. They had to try. As they talked, she felt a glimmer of hope, something she hadn't felt in weeks. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, Father John arranged for a trusted doctor, Dr. Emile, to meet them in secret. They couldn't risk the bishop finding out, so they chose a small, secluded chapel outside the village for the meeting. She arrived early, her nerves on edge, but also filled with a sense of determination. Dr. Emile was already there when she arrived, his face serious but kind. He listened carefully as she explained everything: the symptoms, the timing, her suspicions about the supplies. He asked detailed questions, his eyes narrowing as he considered the possibilities. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "It's possible," he said. "If someone introduced a hormone into your food or water, it could cause the symptoms you're describing, but we'll need proof." He suggested taking blood samples from the nuns to test for any abnormalities. She agreed, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. The bishop had the monastery under tight control, and getting the samples without being caught would be risky. But they had no other choice. They had to try. As they made their plan, she felt a mix of fear and hope. She didn't know if they would succeed, but she knew they had to try. For the first time in weeks, she felt like they were finally taking control of the situation, instead of just reacting to it. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. Dr. Emil explained that they would need to act quickly. The longer they waited, the harder it would be to gather evidence. He suggested that they start with the nuns who were most affected, like Sister Lucy and Sister Agnes. They would need to find a way to get the samples without alerting the bishop or his men. Father John offered to help, using his connections to arrange a distraction at the monastery while they collected the samples. She felt a surge of gratitude for their support, but she also knew the risks. If they were caught, it wouldn't just mean the end of their plan. It could mean the end of everything. But she couldn't think about that now. She had to focus on the task at hand. As they finalized their plan, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. They were finally doing something, finally fighting back. She didn't know if it would be enough, but she knew they had to try. For the first time in a long time, she felt like there was a chance, however small, that they could prove their innocence. And that was enough to keep her going. That evening, under the cover of darkness, they put their plan into action. Father John created a diversion at the monastery, drawing the attention of the bishop's men while she and Dr. Emil slipped inside. The air was thick with tension as they moved through the shadows, every sound making her heart race. They made their way to the infirmary where the accused nuns were being held. She could see the fear in their eyes as they entered, but she quickly explained what they were doing. Sister Lucy, pale and trembling, was the first to agree. Dr. Emil worked quickly, taking blood samples while she kept watch at the door. Every second felt like an eternity, her ears straining for any sign that they had been discovered. But they managed to get the samples without incident, and they slipped back out into the night as quietly as they had come. As they made their way back to the village, she felt a mix of relief and anxiety. They had the samples, but now they had to wait for the results, and until then, they were still in danger. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. They had taken the first step, and there was no turning back now. The walk back to the village felt longer than usual, the weight of what they had just done pressing down on her. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the bishop's men following them. But the night remained quiet, the only sound the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel path. Dr. Emil carried the samples carefully, his face set in a determined expression. She could see the worry in his eyes, but he didn't say anything. They both knew the stakes. If the bishop found out what they were doing, it wouldn't just mean the end of their plan. It could mean the end of everything. When they finally reached the village, they went straight to Dr. Emil's clinic. He set to work immediately, preparing the samples for testing. She sat in the corner, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She thought about the other nuns, still locked away in the monastery, their futures hanging in the balance. She thought about Sister Lucy, so young and terrified, and Sister Agnes, who had always been a source of strength for the others. She couldn't let them down. She had to keep going no matter how scared she was. As the hours passed, she felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. She didn't know what the results would show, but she knew they had done everything they could. And for now, that was enough. The next few days were a blur of waiting and uncertainty. She stayed hidden in the village, relying on the kindness of Father John and a few trusted villagers to keep her safe. Every day felt like a year, her mind constantly racing with thoughts of what might happen if they were discovered. She thought about the other nuns still locked away in the monastery and wondered if they knew what she was doing. She hoped they did. She hoped they knew that she was fighting for them, that she hadn't given up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Emil called her into his clinic. His face was grave as he handed her the results. She scanned the document, her heart pounding as she read the words. None of the nuns were pregnant. The symptoms they had been experiencing were caused by an artificial hormone, introduced into their bodies through their food or water. She felt a surge of relief, but it was quickly replaced by anger. Someone had done this to them. Someone had deliberately poisoned them, all to discredit them and take control of the monastery. She didn't know who, but she had a suspicion, and she was going to prove it. She sat down, her hands trembling as she held the document. Dr. Emil explained the findings in more detail, his voice steady but filled with concern. The hormone, he said, was not something that could have been introduced accidentally. It had to have been done intentionally, by someone with access to their food and water supply. She thought about the new supplier, the one who had started delivering their supplies a few weeks ago. At the time, it had seemed like a blessing, but now it felt like a curse. She didn't know who was behind it, but she had a feeling it was someone close to the bishop, someone who had something to gain from their downfall. She thanked Dr. Emil and left the clinic, her mind racing. She needed to get this information to Mother Superior Mary, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. The monastery was still under the bishop's control, and getting inside without being caught would be nearly impossible. But she had to try. She couldn't let this injustice stand. She met with Father John later that day, and together they made a plan. They would need to act quickly before the bishop could cover his tracks. Father John suggested they gather as much evidence as possible, including the test results and any records of the new supplier. They would need to present their case to the higher church authorities, but they knew it wouldn't be easy. The bishop was a powerful man, and he had many allies, but they had the truth on their side, and that was something no amount of power could change. As they finalized their plan, she felt a mix of fear and determination. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. They were going to fight for the truth no matter what it took. The next morning they set their plan into motion. Father John used his connections to arrange a meeting with a high-ranking church official who was known for his integrity. She knew this was their best chance. If they could present their evidence to someone who wasn't under the bishop's influence, they might have a shot at justice. The meeting was tense, the air thick with anticipation as they laid out their case. She handed over the test results along with the records of the new supplier and explained everything they had discovered. The official listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he nodded. "This is serious," he said. "If what you're saying is true, we need to act quickly." He promised to bring the matter before the church council and ordered an immediate investigation. She felt a surge of hope, but she also knew the fight wasn't over yet. The bishop was a powerful man, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. But for the first time in weeks, she felt like they had a real chance. They had the truth on their side, and that was something no amount of power could change. The official wasted no time. Within hours, a team of investigators arrived at the monastery, their presence causing a stir among the bishop's men. She watched from a distance, her heart pounding as she saw the bishop's face turn pale. He tried to protest, to dismiss the investigation as unnecessary, but the official stood firm. "This is a matter of great importance," he said. "We must uncover the truth." The investigators began their work, interviewing the nuns, examining the supplies, and reviewing the monastery's records. She could see the fear in the bishop's eyes, the way he tried to control the situation but was slowly losing his grip. She knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. As the investigation continued, she felt a mix of relief and anxiety. They were so close, but they weren't there yet. She thought about the other nuns, still locked away, their futures hanging in the balance. She thought about Sister Lucy, so young and terrified, and Sister Agnes, who had always been a source of strength for the others. She couldn't let them down. She had to keep going no matter how scared she was. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The investigators worked tirelessly, uncovering more and more evidence of the bishop's involvement. They found records of payments to the new supplier, as well as documents linking the bishop to the introduction of the hormone. It was clear that he had orchestrated the entire thing, all to gain control of the monastery. She felt a mix of anger and relief as the truth came to light. They had done it. They had uncovered the conspiracy and exposed the bishop for what he really was. But she also knew that the fight wasn't over yet. They still had to face the bishop, and she knew it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in weeks, she felt like they had a real chance. They had the truth on their side, and that was something no amount of power could change. The final confrontation came a few days later, in a meeting of the church council. She stood before them, her heart pounding but her voice steady as she presented their evidence. The bishop was there, his face pale but his expression defiant. He tried to dismiss their claims, to turn the council against them, but the evidence was too strong. The test results, the records, the testimony of the nuns, it all pointed to one conclusion. The bishop had orchestrated the entire thing, all to gain control of the monastery. The council was silent as she finished speaking, the weight of the truth hanging heavy in the air. Finally, the head of the council stood and delivered their verdict. The bishop was stripped of his title and excommunicated from the church. The nuns were declared innocent, their honor restored. She felt a surge of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of quiet satisfaction. They had done it. They had fought for the truth and they had won. As she left the meeting, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in months. The nightmare was over, and they could finally begin to rebuild. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. They had faced their fears and they had come out stronger on the other side. And that was something no one could ever take away from them.